You damn hypocrite, Crockett. That was Donald Trump's explosive outburst in a congressional hearing watched by more than 30 million Americans. Across the screen, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett stood frozen for a second, then dropped the kind of revelation that could shake the entire free world. She claimed Trump struck a secret deal with President Zelenskyy. If Ukraine surrendered its occupied territories to Russia, Zelenskyy would secure 10 more years in power. 10 years, while over 50,000 Ukrainian civilians have already been killed and millions driven from their homes. One man chasing power, another man clinging to it, and a nation sold off like currency. This isn't just politics. It's betrayal, corruption, and the death of democracy unfolding live on the world stage. The air inside the chamber was thick, charged with a tension so sharp it could cut through bone. Every camera lens pointed forward, every breath held hostage by anticipation. And then, Jasmine Crockett rose. She pushed back her chair with a slow, deliberate motion, her face carved with steel determination. Her voice, when it broke the silence, was sharp enough to split the marble walls. I will prove, before Congress and before the entire world, that President Donald Trump and President Volodymyr Zelenskyy conspired to sell out Ukraine, trading away its land for raw power. The words landed like a bomb. A ripple of shock raced through the hall. Reporters gasped. Senators turned to one another, their whispers colliding into a storm of disbelief. The room erupted. Shouts, jeers, a thunder of fists against wooden desks. But Crockett didn't flinch. Her hands gripped the edges of the podium, knuckles white, eyes fixed like daggers on Trump himself. He sat only a few feet away, his face a mask of fury barely contained, the famous orange hue flushed red with rage. Trump leaned forward, lips curling, and barked across the chamber. Lies, damn lies, you're a disgrace, Crockett. The chair of the committee hammered the gavel again and again, desperate to restore order. But the chaos only grew louder, fueled by the raw electricity of scandal. Crockett raised her hand, commanding silence not with authority alone, but with the weight of truth waiting to be unleashed. Her voice steadied, lower now, but more dangerous for its calm. This was not a negotiation for peace. This was not diplomacy. This was blackmail, a promise written in shadow: surrender Ukraine's occupied territories to Russia, and in return, Zelenskyy would be guaranteed another 10 years in power. The chamber froze. 10 years. The number hung in the air like poison. 10 years of unchecked rule, purchased with blood and soil that did not belong to them. Somewhere in the back row, a senator let out an audible gasp. Another slammed his hand against the table, muttering, unthinkable, treasonous, under his breath. Crockett pressed on. She would not allow the moment to slip into confusion. While 50,000 Ukrainian civilians have been slaughtered, while millions have been driven from their homes, these two men bargained away freedom as if it were currency. They gambled with lives for power, and they did it in our name. Her voice cracked on the last words, but it wasn't weakness. It was fury restrained, grief sharpened into a blade. Every word echoed through the hall, carried by the cameras to millions of homes across America. Trump slammed his palm onto the desk, the sound like a gunshot. That's a damn lie, a fabrication, a witch hunt. But for once, his bluster did not drown out the truth. The weight of the accusation was too heavy, the evidence too damning. Crockett's eyes narrowed. You can shout, you can deny, but you cannot erase the evidence, Mr. President. She reached into her folder and held up a single sheet of paper, its seal unmistakable. A hush fell over the crowd, anticipation crushing the noise. This is the draft memorandum, signed by officials from both administrations. Here, right here, it spells out the bargain: territorial concessions in exchange for Zelenskyy's prolonged presidency. This is betrayal written in ink. The room convulsed into chaos once more. Journalists leapt to their feet, flashing cameras, fingers flying over keyboards. Pundits already whispered into live microphones. This could be the beginning of the end. Trump's jaw tightened. He tried to sneer, to laugh it off, but the twitch in his eyes betrayed him. For the first time, he looked cornered. Crockett seized the moment. She leaned forward, her voice cutting clean through the storm. You did not save Ukraine. You did not save America. You sold them both for a seat at the throne, and history will not forget. The silence that followed was deafening. Even the chair's gavel paused, suspended in midair, as if the weight of her words had frozen time itself. Trump broke it, his voice hoarse but defiant. History remembers the strong, not the loud, and I am the strongest man this nation has ever seen. The arrogance sent a ripple of disgust through half the chamber, but his supporters bellowed in applause, desperate to keep the fire alive. Crockett straightened, unshaken. Her eyes swept across the chamber, across the faces of colleagues, across the cameras, beaming her words to the nation. Strength is not betrayal. Strength is not selling out millions of lives for 10 years of power. Strength is standing on the side of justice, even when it costs you everything. And you, Mr. President, have none. Gasps, murmurs, a slow, rising chant from somewhere in the gallery. Traitor, traitor, traitor. Trump's face twisted with rage, but he did not move. For the first time in years, he seemed unable to find words to shield himself. The chair finally brought the gavel down once, twice, 3 times. Order! Order in this chamber! But order had already been shattered. The truth had been spoken, and nothing, not gavel, nor threats, nor denials, could seal it back again. And so began the most explosive hearing in American history. Trump rose. He did not simply stand. He exploded upward like a man spring-loaded with rage. The chair rattled backward, skidding against the polished floor as his hand slammed down on the desk. Outright lies, shameless lies. His voice thundered across the chamber. No one dares accuse me like this. The chamber quaked with the force of his outburst. His loyalists clapped, pounded the tables, roared in defiance like a pack shielding its alpha. But behind the roar, there was something else, a flicker, barely visible in the way his fingers trembled as they gripped the wood, the way his chest heaved too quickly for a man trying to appear calm, the way his eyes darted, just once, toward the damning document in Crockett's hand. He swallowed hard, forcing arrogance back onto his face like a mask hastily reapplied. Trump jabbed a finger toward Jasmine Crockett, his voice dropping into a venomous growl. This is nothing more than a witch hunt orchestrated by radicals who despise me, who despise America. They invent, they fabricate, they twist reality. And now this woman, this so-called defender of democracy, dares to lecture me? His words, sharp and loaded with venom, rolled through the room. Some senators nodded, others shifted uncomfortably. The nation was watching, split down the middle, half leaning forward in rage, the other half in disbelief. Crockett did not blink. Her eyes, steady and unyielding, locked onto Trump's like a steel against fire. Trump spread his arms wide as though to embrace the chamber, the country, the cameras. Do you think peace is free? Do you think nations survive on fairy tales of justice and honor? No. Peace is bought. Stability is earned through deals. Tough deals that weaklings like Crockett could never understand. The words drew cheers from his loyal base. But even in their applause, there was an unease, a shadow cast by the very allegations he tried to bury under bravado. Trump leaned forward, his voice swelling, his body trembling with fury barely disguised as strength. If Zelenskyy wanted to protect his people, he had to make sacrifices. That's leadership. That's survival. That's what I gave him. Gasps rippled through the chamber. Had he just confessed? Or had he twisted the line so artfully that it teetered between admission and denial? Crockett seized the moment, her voice slicing into his tirade. Sacrifices? You call surrendering a nation's land to an invader a sacrifice? You call handing Putin the keys to Ukraine an act of leadership? Tell that to the 50,000 dead. Tell that to the millions without homes. Trump's fist slammed the desk. The echo reverberated like a gunshot in the hushed hall. Enough! You will not put words in my mouth. But the damage was done. The image of a leader shouting, sweating, and flailing beneath the weight of truth was seared into every watching eye. The chairman's gavel pounded again and again. Order! Order in the chamber! But his voice was drowned beneath the hurricane. Trump's supporters shouted, Witch hunt! Witch hunt! Opponents fired back. Traitor! Traitor! The chamber fractured, democracy itself splitting down the aisle. Trump raised both arms, commanding attention once more. His face, flushed and glistening, twisted into a sneer. You call me a traitor? I am the reason America stands strong today. I am the shield that kept this nation safe from war, from chaos, from ruin. Without me, you'd all be speaking Russian by now. The words ignited half the room. Applause and jeers collided in a storm so deafening, it felt as if the marble pillars themselves would crack. But there, beneath the fury, lingered the image of a man on edge, lashing out not from dominance but from fear. Crockett let the silence stretch a moment longer, then leaned into the microphone. Her tone was quiet, deadly. Fear, Mr. President. That is what we see. Fear of the truth. Fear of the evidence. Fear that history will strip away your mask and reveal what you truly are. Not a savior, but a coward who sold a nation for power. The words landed like a blade driven into the heart of his defense. Trump's jaw clenched. His breath came heavy. For a fleeting second, his mask cracked. The camera caught it. The twitch, the tightening of his lips, the wild flare in his eyes. And millions watching at home saw it too. Not strength, not defiance, but the unmistakable scent of panic. The chairman slammed the gavel again, his voice hoarse now. Order! Order! This chamber will not dissolve into chaos. But chaos was already alive, breathing, unstoppable. Trump slammed both fists down, shaking the desk. This is America's darkest day. And you, Crockett, you will pay for what you've done. Gasps filled the air. The threat was undeniable. Crockett leaned back slowly, her expression unbroken, her silence louder than his roar. The hearing teetered on the edge of collapse, the nation watching as two figures, one consumed by rage, the other armed with truth, clashed in a battle that would define history. And in that moment, one thing was certain. The storm had only just begun. Jasmine Crockett did not hesitate. She pulled a folder from the stack in front of her and rose to her feet, her shoulders squared, her gaze locked like a hawk. With one swift motion, she lifted the document high, the white paper stark against the mahogany glow of the chamber lights. Every camera zoomed in. Every senator leaned forward. The air itself seemed to tighten, drawn into the fragile flutter of pages that held more weight than any weapon. Her voice cut through the silence like steel through cloth. This is the draft agreement. Here it states, in black and white, President Volodymyr Zelenskyy will concede Ukraine's occupied territories to Russia, and in return, the United States guarantees him another 10 years in power. The chamber exploded. Gasps, shouts, curses, an orchestra of disbelief. One lawmaker clutched his forehead, another slammed the table in rage. Even hardened veterans of Washington leaned back in shock, their mouths hanging open. 10 years. The number echoed through the marble walls. Chilling, grotesque. 10 years of power bought with blood-soaked soil. 10 years purchased not with ballots, but with betrayal. Trump shifted in his chair. For the first time, his confidence cracked. His fingers twitched against the desk. His jaw tightened. His lips pressed thin. He tried to appear unmoved, but his body betrayed him. The restless tapping of his shoe, the frantic flicker in his eyes. Crockett spread the document open on the table before her, the red seals glowing under the bright lights. The camera lenses drank in every line, every signature, every trace of ink that turned a nation's suffering into political currency. She leaned into the microphone, her tone unyielding. 50,000 Ukrainian civilians already dead. More than 7 million driven from their homes. Entire towns reduced to rubble. And while Ukraine bled, while Russia carved its empire by force, two men sat behind closed doors and carved their own futures. Trump and Zelenskyy, trading land for power, gambling with lives as though they were poker chips. Her voice did not waver. It sharpened with each word, rising with fury, restrained only by discipline. The chamber held its breath, as though every person there understood that history itself was being rewritten in real time. On the giant projection screen above, the words glared back at them. Recognition of territorial status quo in exchange for long-term presidential guarantee. Cold, clinical, deadly, bureaucratic ink masking human blood. A senator muttered, "My God," loud enough for the microphones to catch. Another whispered, "This is treason." Trump finally broke his silence. He leaned forward, knuckles pressed to the desk, his voice ragged but loud. "This is a fabrication, a forgery. No one can prove I authorized this." But the words rang hollow. The cameras had already captured his flicker of panic, and America was watching. Crockett seized the opening, her eyes locked on him, unflinching, merciless. Her voice dropped, low and sharp enough to pierce his armor. "Mr. President, you can scream forgery all you want, but this document carries signatures, seals, and dates. And more than that, it carries the blood of a people betrayed. You did not save Ukraine. You did not save democracy. You sold them both for a throne, for 10 years of borrowed time." The chamber roared again. Reporters shouted into phones. Anchors scrambled for breaking coverage. Screens across the country lit up with headlines. "Secret deal revealed. Land traded for power." Trump's loyalists tried to shout her down, bellowing, "Fake!" and "Witch hunt." But their voices were weak against the sheer weight of the evidence. The chairman's gavel pounded over and over. "Order! Order!" he demanded, though even he looked pale, shaken by what lay in front of him. Crockett didn't move. She let the fury of the chamber swirl around her, let the storm rage unchecked. She stood as its center, calm, unbreakable, her words reverberating through the chaos. "This is not politics. This is not negotiation. This is betrayal, the kind that will be remembered in history books, the kind that will stain our nation's honor if we allow it to stand." Trump's face twisted, veins bulging at his temples. He opened his mouth to strike back, but the timing had shifted. The room, the nation, the world. They had all seen the paper. They had all heard the number. 10 years, and no roar, no insult, no denial could drown it out. The chairman's gavel fell again, the crack of wood against wood echoing like a cannon. But the room was beyond control. What had been a hearing only moments ago was now something far larger, a reckoning. Trump finally broke the suffocating silence. He leaned back in his chair, lips curling into the faintest smirk, the kind of smirk he wore when cornered, but unwilling to admit defeat. A chuckle slipped out, low, derisive, rehearsed. "That," he scoffed, gesturing lazily toward the damning document still glowing on the projection screen. "That's nothing but a draft note, a scribble. Diplomacy is full of drafts, negotiations, posturing. That's what politics is. Compromise, bargaining, hard talk. This is just a routine memorandum, blown out of proportion by people who don't understand how the real world works." The words dripped with false nonchalance. They were meant to soothe, to dismiss, to reduce the explosive evidence to nothing more than bureaucratic clutter. But they did not soothe, because as he spoke, a sheen of sweat glistened on his forehead. Tiny droplets formed at his temples, catching the unforgiving glare of the cameras. And though his voice projected bravado, his hands betrayed him, fingers twitching against the wood, restless, jittery. The mask of confidence was cracking. Crockett's gaze never wavered. She tilted her head slightly, as if studying a specimen beneath glass. The chamber remained electric, every soul inside feeling the dissonance between his words and his body. Trump leaned forward again, voice rising with manufactured conviction. "I've signed hundreds of drafts like this in my career. Everyone here knows that's how it works. You push, you bluff, you create leverage. None of this was ever binding. None of this was real. If anything, it shows my brilliance in negotiation. It shows how I kept America safe by making others believe I'd give them what they wanted, when in fact, I gave them nothing." He slammed his palm on the desk, punctuating the lie with force. The sound echoed, sharp and violent, but it did not erase the tremor in his voice. Crockett leaned into her microphone, her tone icy. "If this was just a draft, Mr. President, why was it stamped, sealed, and signed by officials from both governments? Why was it prepared for final review? Why were there witness notes from your own staff confirming the terms were discussed and agreed upon? Her questions landed like arrows, piercing through his flimsy armor. Trump sneered, waving his hand. Staff? Staff always scribble things, always chase their own agendas. I can't control every piece of paper floating around Washington. If you think this proves something, you're grasping at straws. This is politics. And politics, Crockett, isn't about fairy tales of justice. It's about power, survival, deals. He drew out the last word as though savoring it. But the chamber was not convinced. Reporters murmured frantically. Lawmakers whispered among themselves. The sweat now rolled down his cheek, a bead carving its way through the powder caked on his skin. He wiped it away quickly, almost angrily, but not before the cameras caught it. And America saw. Not strength, not confidence, but fear. Crockett rose again, slow and deliberate. She placed both palms flat on the table, leaning forward, her voice low but resonant. You call it politics. I call it betrayal. You call it negotiation. I call it selling out an entire nation for 10 more years of power. You call it survival. I call it cowardice dressed as strategy. Her words sliced through the air, sharper than any gavel, louder than the chaos that buzzed beneath the surface. Trump barked a laugh, but it was hollow, brittle. You think you sound righteous, don't you? But righteousness doesn't win wars. Righteousness doesn't stop tanks. Righteousness doesn't keep food on the tables of American families. Power does, and I am power. That's why people elected me, and that's why they'll elect me again. He jabbed a finger toward the crowd of cameras, his grin wide but desperate. Mark my words, no one out there cares about your sanctimonious speeches, Crockett. They care about safety. They care about strength. And I've delivered both. The words rang, but the chamber heard something else entirely. They heard the strain, the panic, the man grasping at his old magic, trying to summon the charisma that once bent crowds to his will, but now here fell flat. Crockett did not raise her voice. She didn't need to. Strength is not selling land to an invader. Safety is not bartering away freedom. Leadership is not hiding behind drafts and pretending betrayal is strategy. You may fool some, Mr. President. You may even fool yourself, but you will not fool history. History is watching, and it will not forgive. The chamber fell silent. Trump shifted again, tugging at his collar, his smirk faltering. He opened his mouth, but no words came. The sweat glistened. The cameras zoomed closer. The silence deepened. And in that silence, the world saw a man stripped bare, his arrogance a costume, his bluster a shield, his excuses dissolving under the weight of truth. The gavel came down hard, wood splintering against wood. Order! Order in the chamber, the chairman cried, his own voice tight with disbelief. But order was gone. The evidence stood, undeniable, glaring on the screen. And Trump's attempt to dismiss it as a mere draft had only exposed what he feared most, that the mask no longer fit. Then the monitors flickered, static hissed through the speakers, a thin white crackle that sent a shiver across the chamber. The massive screen above the committee table brightened, shifting from the damning text of the draft agreement to a live video feed. And there he was, Volodymyr Zelenskyy. His face, projected larger than life, was pale, drawn, almost ghostly. Deep shadows pooled beneath his eyes, lines etched across his forehead, as though carved by sleepless nights and unbearable choices. Behind him, the dimly lit backdrop of Kiev flickered, a capital under siege, walls marked by exhaustion and war. A hush swept through the chamber. No one moved. No one dared even to breathe. Jasmine Crockett leaned forward, her voice cutting through the silence. President Zelenskyy, she said, her words deliberate, steady, razor sharp. Did you agree to a clause guaranteeing your rule for 10 more years in exchange for conceding Ukrainian land to Russia? The question slammed into the chamber with the force of a hammer. Zelenskyy froze. His lips parted, but no sound emerged. His eyes flickered away from the camera, as though searching the room around him for an exit that did not exist. Seconds passed, each one heavier than the last. The silence itself became unbearable, thick, suffocating. It was the silence of a man torn between truth and survival. Finally, Zelenskyy bowed his head. The world watched as his shoulders sagged under an invisible weight. And then, with a voice barely more than a whisper, he said, We had no other choice. Gas erupted across the chamber. The words were soft, fragile, but they carried the violence of an earthquake. Trump jerked upright in his chair, eyes wide. No, no, that's not what he means, he barked, his hands slicing the air. He's being taken out of context. Occurrences, but the damage had already been done. Crockett pressed forward, refusing to let the moment escape. No choice, Mr. President, she repeated, her tone laced with both grief and fury. No choice but to barter away sovereign land? No choice but to extend your own presidency while your people bury their dead? Zelensky's face tightened. His eyes glistened, but he did not look up. His silence was more damning than any word he could have spoken. The chamber erupted into chaos again. Shouts of treason, colliding with cries of lies. Reporters scrambled to relay the confession, phones buzzing across the globe as the footage streamed live into millions of homes. Crockett's voice pierced through the storm. President Zelenskyy, tell this chamber, was Donald Trump involved in offering this deal? Zelenskyy's lips trembled. The camera zoomed closer, magnifying every flicker of doubt, every crack of guilt. For a moment he said nothing. The silence stretched so long that it became unbearable, the chamber holding its collective breath. And then finally, in a voice hoarse with exhaustion, he admitted, the offer came from him. The words detonated like a missile strike. Lawmakers leapt from their chairs. Some shouted in outrage, others in disbelief. The very foundation of the chamber seemed to tremble beneath the weight of the admission. Trump's roar cut through the chaos. Lies, absolute lies. He's weak, he's scared. He's saying whatever they force him to say. This is propaganda, fake news, fake news. But his voice, once thunder, now sounded brittle, fraying at the edges. Crockett's gaze remained fixed on Zelenskyy. Her voice dropped low, calm, merciless. So, in the middle of war, while your people died, you agreed to sell land to the invader, and Donald Trump promised you a decade more of power in return. Zelenskyy finally looked up, his eyes rimmed with tears. You don't understand, he whispered. Our army was bleeding. Our supplies were gone. We were abandoned. I had to think of survival. I had to think of... His voice cracked, and the sentence collapsed into silence. The chamber sat in stunned disbelief. Crockett stepped back from the microphone, her face carved with sorrow but her eyes still blazing. Survival bought with betrayal is not survival. It's surrender. Trump slammed both fists onto the desk, his face crimson. This is treachery against me, against America. He's the one who betrayed his people, not me. But the cameras caught everything, the sweat dripping from his temple, the desperation etched into his features, the wildness in his eyes. Zelenskyy's image flickered on the screen, the signal weakening, his face fading into static. But his final words lingered like an open wound. We had no other choice. The feed cut to black. The chamber was left in silence, thick, choking, unbearable silence. Every senator, every reporter, every viewer across the globe sat frozen, as if the world itself had stopped turning. Crockett looked around the room, her voice soft but resolute. No choice. There was always a choice, and the choice was betrayal. The words hung in the air like a sentence, sealing the chamber in its gravity. And in that silence, one truth became inescapable. The facade had crumbled, the deal exposed, the players unmasked. There was no hiding anymore. The chamber erupted. Dozens of voices tore through the air at once, clashing like steel against steel. Some senators shot to their feet, fists pounding the mahogany desks. Others shouted across the aisle, their voices raw with outrage. Treason, one cried, his voice cracking with fury. Betrayal, another roared, slamming his palm against the table so hard the microphone squealed. The words spread like wildfire. Traitor, 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 till it became a chorus, deafening, relentless, shaking the marble pillars. Reporters scrambled to their feet, phones pressed to ears, cameras whirring and flashing in a frenzy. The gallery above swelled with noise, spectators shouting, gasping, pointing down at the man seated in the center of the storm. Trump. He sat rigid, fists clenched, face a mask of livid red. His lips moved as though to speak, but his voice was drowned beneath the avalanche of accusation. At the head of the committee table, the chairman's gavel cracked down. Once, twice, again and again, wood splintering beneath the force. "Order! Order! This chamber will come to order!" But there was no order left to salvage. The sound of the gavel was nothing against the roar of democracy tearing itself apart inside the very heart of its house. Crockett remained standing, her posture unshaken, eyes burning with fire. She did not add to the chaos. She let it burn. She let the fury of the chamber reveal what words alone could not. The truth was out, and it could not be contained. On one side, Republican loyalists screamed, "Set up! Witch hunt!" Their voices cracked with desperation, the defense sounding more hollow with every repetition. On the other, Democrats rose to their feet, jabbing fingers toward Trump, their faces twisted with rage. He sold out Ukraine. He sold out us all. The floor had become a battlefield, two armies screaming across a canyon of betrayal. Trump finally surged to his feet, slamming both hands onto the table so hard that water glasses rattled and spilled. His voice, hoarse but forceful, thundered above the chaos. "Silence! I am your president!" The chamber fell into a fractured hush, gasps and mutters simmering beneath the surface. Trump's chest heaved as he straightened his jacket, trying to reclaim the aura of control. But the sweat shining on his brow betrayed him, glistening under the relentless lights. He raised a finger, jabbing toward Crockett. "This is all theater. Lies and theater. They want you to believe a piece of paper means betrayal. They want you to believe a desperate man in Kyiv speaks the truth. But I am the truth. I am the shield that kept this nation safe." The words cracked through the air, bold, defiant. But the chamber did not return to him. A lone voice from the back answered, low but audible. "A shield doesn't sell allies to invaders." The silence that followed was heavier than the shouting. It pressed down like stone, suffocating, irreversible. Trump's jaw tightened. He opened his mouth to unleash another tirade, but the chairman's gavel came down again, thunderous, final. "Enough!" The old man's voice boomed through the microphones, louder than it had been all day. "This chamber is not a circus. This chamber is not a battlefield. It is a court of reckoning, and reckoning we shall have." The room quieted, though the air still crackled with tension. Senators sank back into their seats, though many still muttered under their breath, unable to contain the storm inside them. Reporters sat stunned, fingers hovering above keyboards, struggling to capture the scale of what was unfolding. Crockett slowly lowered herself back into her chair, her eyes never leaving Trump. Her silence was louder than the chaos had been. It was the silence of someone who had struck a mortal blow and did not need to strike again. Trump, still standing, scanned the room. His gaze darted from face to face. Colleagues who had once cheered him now looking away. Supporters who now seemed unsure. Allies whose expressions cracked under the weight of doubt. For a fleeting moment, his face faltered. His eyes widened, lips parted, as though he too realized the tide had shifted irrevocably. Then the mask returned. Anger, defiance, arrogance painted over panic. He raised his chin, trying to stand taller than the storm. But everyone in the chamber knew. The shouting had revealed more than silence ever could. The mask had slipped, and the truth was alive, impossible to bury. And as the chairman's gavel echoed one final time, its sound reverberating like the toll of a great bell, one reality became inescapable. The chamber had witnessed the unmasking of a president, and the verdict of history had already begun to write itself. But Jasmine Crockett wasn't finished. She reached for another folder, her fingers steady, her expression carved from stone. With a single nod to the technician seated at the control panel, she gave the signal. The giant monitors flickered once again. The chamber hushed instinctively, the kind of silence that comes before a storm. And then, Trump's voice filled the room. Not the defensive bluster they had just heard in person, not the fiery roar of a man lashing out. This was quieter, calculated, cold. "If you accept Russia keeping what they've already taken, I will guarantee you 10 more years as president." The words slithered through the speakers, slow and deliberate, every syllable sharp as glass. The chamber froze. Gasps sucked the oxygen from the room. The sound of his voice, clear, undeniable, pressed down like a hand closing around every throat. No one moved, no one dared breathe. It was Trump. There was no mistaking it. His cadence, his inflection, the unmistakable rhythm of a man used to making deals in shadows. Crockett let the recording play again. The same line, the same damning promise. Over and over, the words twisted deeper into the walls of the chamber. If you accept Russia keeping what they've already taken, I will guarantee you 10 more years as president. The chairman's gavel slipped from his grip and clattered against the desk, but he did not reach to retrieve it. His hand trembled, his eyes fixed on the monitor as though the very weight of democracy had just been dropped onto his shoulders. Trump shot to his feet, face crimson, sweat dripping down his temples. That's a fake, a deep fake, some AI nonsense cooked up by radicals. That's not me. It's not me. But his protest sounded hollow, weak, desperate, because everyone knew. Every person in that chamber had heard Donald Trump's voice for years. They knew its texture, its weight, its venom. This was no fake. The murmurs began to ripple from the gallery above, from the senators across the aisle, from the reporters already whispering into live microphones. Crockett stood, her face calm, her voice cutting through the panic like a scalpel. Ladies and gentlemen, the audio is authenticated by 3 independent forensic labs. Voice analysis, spectral imaging, linguistic markers, all confirm the speaker is Donald J. Trump. She paused, letting the name echo through the stunned silence. These are not the words of a statesman. These are the words of a man trading freedom for power, trading democracy for dictatorship, selling out not only Ukraine, but every principle this nation claims to stand for. Her words landed like hammer blows. Trump slammed his fist on the desk, the sound cracking like a gunshot. Lies! This is a witch hunt! They've been after me since day one. You're watching a coup, not a hearing. A coup! But even as he screamed, his eyes betrayed him. They darted wildly, searching for loyal faces, for nods of agreement, and found fewer than ever before. The chamber was shifting. The tide was turning. One senator whispered, almost to himself, "My God, he said it. He actually said it." Another dropped his pen, the clatter echoing through the silence. A third buried her face in her hands. The audio played again. Trump's voice, calm, transactional, obscene in its simplicity. If you accept Russia keeping what they've already taken, I will guarantee you 10 more years as president. The words lingered in the air long after the speakers clicked off. It was as if the very walls had absorbed them, searing them into the foundation of the chamber. Crockett's voice was quiet now, but no less powerful. There it is, the second piece of evidence. Not a draft, not speculation. His own words, his own voice, his own betrayal. The chamber was silent, not with peace, but with shock so absolute it smothered every sound. It was the silence of history shifting beneath their feet. Trump tried again, his voice cracking with desperation. I was negotiating. That's what leaders do. I was bluffing, trying to force leverage. It's called strategy. But no one believed him. Not now. Not after hearing the promise laid bare in his own voice. The chairman finally retrieved his gavel, his hand trembling as he raised it. But before he could bring it down, a voice rose from the back. That's treason. It was not shouted. It was spoken plainly, coldly, with the weight of conviction. The words spread through the chamber like fire catching dry timber. Treason, treason, treason. Trump's face drained of color. His lips parted, but no words came. The mask, the bravado, the arrogance, it was gone. And in its place stood a man cornered by his own voice. Trump snapped. His hand slammed down on the desk, rattling glasses, scattering papers to the floor. His body surged forward like a trapped animal lashing out. That's doctored. That's spliced together. That is not my voice, he roared, the words tearing out of his throat so violently that the microphone crackled with distortion. The sound ricocheted off the marble walls, raw and jagged. But his eyes, those restless, darting eyes, betrayed him. They flickered left, then right, as if searching for escape routes in a room with none. They wavered not with the steadiness of certainty, but with the panic of a man who knew he had been cornered. Jasmine Crockett did not flinch. She watched him like a surgeon observes a patient thrashing under the knife, calm, precise, waiting for the moment when the truth cuts deepest. Trump jabbed a finger at the technicians in the back, his voice cracking with rage. "You think you're clever, don't you? Stitching together words, faking tapes, using computers to make me sound like I said something I didn't. This is all fake news. Witchcraft, a digital assassination." He turned to the chamber, sweeping his arm in a wide arc. "And you're all falling for it. Every single one of you is being played. This is a coup against your president." But the cries that answered him were not supportive. "Liar!" someone shouted. "Traitor!" came another. The words rang louder than his protest, and for the first time, the volume of the chamber outweighed his roar. Trump's lips trembled. His face was flushed, not just with anger, but with the unmistakable shine of desperation. He tugged at his collar, his breathing ragged, sweat soaking the fine fabric of his suit. He tried again, forcing his voice into the booming register that once commanded arenas. "This is strategy. That's what you don't understand. That's why none of you could ever lead. I play the long game. I bluff. I make them think I'll give them what they want, and then I take it all back. That's negotiation. That's art." His chest heaved as he spread his arms, as if daring the chamber to believe him. But the silence that followed was suffocating. Because everyone knew, bluffs don't come stamped with official seals. Bluffs don't end with a promise of 10 years in power. Bluffs don't sound like bargains with invaders while bombs fall on civilians. Crockett's voice broke the silence, low and cutting. "You call it art. I call it treason." "Oh no." Trump spun toward her, his face contorted, his fingers stabbing the air like a weapon. "You're nothing. You're a disgrace to this chamber, a disgrace to this country. You don't know what it takes to protect America. You don't know the first thing about power." But the words did not carry the force they once did. They trembled at the edges, frayed by fear. Crockett stood slowly, deliberately, her chair scraping back against the polished floor. She leaned into her microphone, her voice steady, resonant, unshakable. "Power without principle is corruption, and corruption that sells out allies, that sells out democracy, is not leadership, it is betrayal." Her words reverberated like a bell tolling through the chamber. Trump tried to laugh, but the sound cracked halfway into a cough. He slammed a hand against his chest, waved the other angrily. "You're dramatic. You want a stage, don't you? You think you can stand there and play saint while I'm crucified? Well, let me tell you something. Without me, Ukraine would have been wiped off the map. Without me, NATO would have collapsed. Without me, you'd all be on your knees begging Putin for mercy." His voice crescendoed into a scream, spittle flying, his fist pounding the desk with each declaration. But the chamber didn't roar with him this time. It recoiled. Every word, every frantic gesture, every crimson vein straining against his skin painted the image not of a savior, but of a man unraveling before the world. The chairman's gavel pounded, desperate to contain the chaos. But order was long gone. Reporters scribbled in feverish panic, their voices whispering urgent updates into live feeds. "The president is unraveling. He's shouting, sweating, lashing out." And the American people watching live from their living rooms could see it too. Not power, not confidence, but fear. Crockett's voice rose once more, not loud but resonant enough to pierce the noise. "The world just heard your voice make a bargain with an invader, and now they hear you scream in panic. History will remember both, but it will not forgive." Trump's face twisted, his mouth opening to hurl another denial. But for the briefest moment, just a flicker, the chamber saw it. The truth, that he knew he was caught, that the fortress of bluster and bravado had collapsed, leaving only the man beneath, cornered, desperate, and terrified. And then the chamber erupted again, this time not in confusion, but in fury. The Democrats rose as one, their voices colliding into a wave that shook the walls. "Treason!" they cried. "Betrayal of the highest order!" Fists pounded desks, fingers jabbed across the aisle, their chants swelling into something primal, something historic. For years they had accused. For years they had warned. Now they had proof, Trump's own voice sealing his betrayal in iron and fire. On the other side, the Republican bench fractured like glass under pressure. Some still shouted, "Witch hunt," but their words rang thin, drowned by the thunder of outrage. Others, men and women who had once cheered Trump like a king, sat frozen, their eyes glued to the desk, unwilling to meet his gaze. One senator shifted uncomfortably in his chair, tugging at his tie. Another buried her face in her hands. A third slowly shook his head, whispering, "I can't defend this." It was the first crack in the wall of loyalty, and it was widening. Trump's eyes darted across them, wild, desperate for affirmation. But it wasn't there anymore. The unwavering loyalty that had once armored him was splintering, piece by piece, under the weight of his own words. Outside the chamber, the storm was already raging. Television screens blared across the nation, headlines flashing in red banners. Trump and Zelenskyy sold out the Ukrainian people. Secret deal, land for power. Treason hearing rocks, Capitol Hill. On the steps of the Capitol, crowds gathered, some screaming in fury, others in disbelief, still others with tears streaking their faces as they clutched signs. Democracy betrayed, and no man above the law. Inside, chaos mounted. Democrats surged forward, voices hoarse from shouting. "He must be impeached immediately," one demanded. "This is treason under the Constitution," cried another. Their voices cracked with rage, with grief, with the kind of urgency that comes when a nation feels its soul slipping away. Trump tried to rise above them, his face flushed, his jaw trembling with the effort of control. "This is mob rule. This is a lynching of your president," he thundered, waving his arms like a conductor of chaos. "You can't do this to me. You can't." But even as he shouted, the floor beneath him was vanishing. Because across the aisle, Republicans who had stood with him for years now looked away, their silence deafening. The camera caught one, an ally once fiercely loyal, muttering under his breath, "God forgive me. We let it go too far." The words leaked out instantly, carried by microphones, broadcast to millions. And in that moment, the fracture widened into a chasm. Crockett remained seated, her face carved in cold resolve. She did not shout. She did not need to. The storm now belonged to others, to those who had finally seen enough. The chairman's gavel slammed again, though his hand trembled. "Order! Order!" he cried, but his voice was swallowed by the thunder. Reporters stood shouting questions, their words barely audible over the cacophony. "Will you resign, Mr. President? Do you deny the tape? Is this treason?" Trump turned on them, snarling, "Fake news, you're all enemies of the people." But the phrase, once a weapon that rallied his base, now fell flat, hollow, overused, stripped of power by the gravity of betrayal. The gallery above stirred with voices. Citizens who had packed the seats shouted down into the chaos, "Traitor! Resign! You don't speak for us!" The sound built into a chant, rolling through the chamber like thunder from the heavens. "Resign! Resign! Resign!" Trump's face blanched. He shook his head violently, gripping the edge of the desk as if clinging to the last scraps of power slipping through his fingers. "Never!" he bellowed, though the word was swallowed by the chant that drowned him. The Democrats pressed harder, their voices cutting like blades. "He bartered with invaders. He sold our allies. This is treason in plain sight." And then the moment that sealed the fracture. From the Republican side, a senator finally rose. His voice was steady, quiet, but it carried through the chaos like a bullet through smoke. "I can no longer defend this president." Gasps erupted, heads turned. Trump's eyes widened, his lips parting in stunned disbelief. The senator's words echoed through the chamber, each syllable heavy with finality. And in that instant, the tide turned fully. What had been fury was now momentum. What had been outrage was now inevitability. Crockett lifted her gaze, her eyes sweeping across the chamber, across the chaos, across the fractured loyalties breaking apart before her. And in her silence, in the steadiness of her presence, the truth stood unshakable. The president's defense had collapsed. His allies were wavering. The nation had seen the betrayal with its own eyes, heard it with its own ears, and history had already begun to brand him, not as a leader, but as a traitor. The chamber held its breath. Jasmine Crockett rose from her seat. Her footsteps echoed against the marble floor, slow and deliberate, the kind of rhythm that feels more like a countdown than a walk. Each step brought her closer to the man at the center of the storm, Donald Trump. He did not move. He sat rigid, his face pale beneath a sweat that beaded and ran down his temple. For once, the trademark smirk was gone. In its place, silence, heavy, fragile, dangerous. Crockett stopped just feet away from his desk. The camera zoomed in, capturing every flicker of her expression, every tremor in his hands. Her voice was cold, sharp, deliberate. You did not just betray Ukraine, Mr. President. You betrayed the trust of the world. You and Zelenskyy placed personal power above the lives of millions of people. Her words fell like hammer strikes against stone. Trump's hand twitched. His knuckles whitened as his fingers clenched the edge of the desk. The sound of his breath, harsh and uneven, crackled faintly through the microphones. He said nothing. The silence was louder than any denial. It reverberated through the chamber, a silence that screamed guilt, a silence that could not be spun or sold or wrapped in bravado. Crockett stepped closer, leaning slightly toward him. Her eyes burned with fire, her voice lowered to a knife's edge. You bartered land you did not own. You gambled with lives that were not yours to risk. And you promised a dictator 10 more years on the throne in exchange for your legacy. That is not diplomacy. That is not strategy. That is treason, plain and unmasked. Trump's lips parted, but no sound came. His throat bobbed as he swallowed hard, his face twitching with the effort of holding back words he could no longer wield. The chamber sat frozen, every senator, every reporter, every spectator, locked on the sight of a president cornered not by enemies, but by truth. One of the microphones caught the faintest sound, his hand trembling against the desk, the wood creaking under the pressure of his grip. Crockett did not look away. She pressed harder, her tone unwavering. You were trusted with the defense of democracy. Instead, you used it as a bargaining chip. You were given the power to protect the innocent. Instead, you traded their safety for your ambition. And now the world sees you, not as a leader, but as a traitor who sold freedom for power. Trump's eyes flickered upward, meeting hers for a brief, burning second. In that look was rage, defiance, but beneath it, fear. He opened his mouth, his voice breaking into a whisper so faint it barely carried. You don't understand. But the words collapsed in his throat. He looked down again, his shoulders stiff, his silence louder than any speech he had ever given. The chairman, pale and weary, leaned into his microphone. The president may respond to the charge, but Trump did not. The silence stretched. It grew heavier with every second, filling the chamber like smoke, suffocating, undeniable. Reporters scribbled furiously, their pens scratching like fire across paper. Trump silent under direct accusation. The gallery murmured, a rising tide of disbelief and outrage. Crockett finally straightened, her words carrying across the chamber with the finality of a verdict. History will not remember your speeches, Mr. President. It will not remember your rallies, your slogans, your boasts. It will remember this moment, the moment you sat in silence when confronted with your betrayal. And that silence will be your legacy. Trump's hand released the desk at last, trembling as it withdrew, the mark of his fingers still pressed into the polished wood. He leaned back in his chair, his chest rising and falling in uneven bursts. But he did not speak. The cameras caught it all. A man once untouchable, silenced not by force but by truth. The chamber erupted into whispers, gasps, murmurs, every sound amplified by the enormity of what had just unfolded. And there, in the heart of the storm, Jasmine Crockett stood unshaken. Her words echoed through the silence, through the walls, through the nation itself. Donald Trump had been confronted, and Donald Trump had no answer. The silence stretched for one last, unbearable heartbeat. Then the chairman raised the gavel high. His hand trembled, not with weakness, but with the weight of history pressing down on his shoulders. His voice, when it came, shook the air like thunder. President Donald J. Trump is hereby charged with betraying the United States of America. Congress will begin immediate impeachment proceedings. The gavel slammed down. The sound cracked through the chamber like a cannon. A single strike that split the air, rattled the marble, and reverberated far beyond those walls. And then, chaos. Applause erupted from the Democratic side, a wave of thunderous clapping and cries of triumph. Some leapt to their feet, pumping fists in the air, their faces blazing with vindication. On the Republican benches, fury boiled. Shouts of illegitimate and sham collided with cheers of justice and finally. The chamber shook with the sound of democracy colliding with itself, every voice a piece of history tearing through the air. From the gallery above came an avalanche of noise. Spectators shouted, screamed, some with tears streaking their cheeks. One voice cried, "Traitor!" Another roared, "Justice for Ukraine!" And soon the chant swelled, a thunderous chorus pounding against the dome. "Justice! Justice! Justice!" Reporters scrambled in a frenzy, their voices tumbling over one another as they relayed the breaking news live to the world. History unfolding on Capitol Hill tonight. President Trump has been charged with betrayal of the United States. Congress to move immediately toward impeachment proceedings. The chamber is in chaos, cheers and fury colliding as America watches. Outside, the crowd that had gathered on the steps of the Capitol roared as the news reached them. Flags waved, signs lifted high, voices cracked in unison as chants spread like fire across the city. Inside, Trump sat frozen. His face was drained of color, his lips pressed into a thin, pale line. The man who had once dominated rooms with sheer force of will now sat hunched, shoulders heavy, hands gripping the armrests of his chair, as though they were the only things keeping him upright. The cameras zoomed in. His eyes, once alight with arrogance, now flickered with disbelief, fury, and fear all at once. And the world saw it. They saw not the master of rallies, not the dealer of power, but the man beneath, cornered by truth, trapped by history, stripped of the shield of denial. Crockett remained standing, unmoving, her eyes fixed on him. She did not smile. She did not cheer. She simply stared, as though etching the image into her memory. The moment the mighty fell, the chairman struck the gavel again. "Order! Order!" But the chamber was beyond control. Democrats chanted, Republicans shouted, the gallery thundered. It was not order that reigned, but reckoning. Trump finally lurched to his feet, his voice raw, his body trembling with rage. "This is illegal. This is a witch hunt. You can't do this to me. I am the President of the United States." The words bellowed across the chaos, but they no longer commanded the room. They echoed hollowly, swallowed by the storm. From the Democratic side, a lawmaker shouted back, "Not anymore." The phrase cut through the chamber, met with an explosion of applause, boos, and chants all at once. The chairman's gavel cracked again, his voice hoarse. "The articles of impeachment will be drafted immediately. This hearing is adjourned." The gavel slammed down one final time. The chamber dissolved into pandemonium. Some hugged, some screamed, some stormed out in rage. The air was electric, searing, unbearable. And through it all, the cameras captured every frame, beaming the image of a nation tearing itself apart, of a president branded a traitor, of history shifting in real time. Trump stood motionless now, his mouth opening and closing without words. He looked left, right, as though seeking allies, but found only turned faces and downcast eyes. The chant from the gallery grew louder, shaking the rafters. "Traitor! Traitor! Traitor!" His jaw tightened, his chest heaved, but he said nothing. The gavel had fallen. The verdict had been spoken. The course of history had turned. Trump pushed himself to his feet. The chair screeched backward against the polished floor, the sound harsh, grating, a mirror of the fury boiling inside him. He leaned into the microphone, his face crimson, veins bulging at his temples, sweat glistening under the relentless lights. "History will stand with me," he shouted, his voice ragged yet defiant. "You will regret this. Every one of you. You'll see. You'll all see." His words tore through the chamber like shards of glass. But they no longer commanded awe. They no longer commanded loyalty. Instead, they landed in a storm of jeers, boos, and thunderous chants. From the Democratic side came cries of "traitor." From the gallery above, the chant swelled again. "Betrayal, betrayal." A pounding chorus that rolled like thunder beneath the dome. Trump's chest heaved as he jabbed a finger toward the crowd, his voice cracking into a roar. "I built this nation's strength. I alone kept the wolves at bay. And this is how you repay me? You are the traitors, not me." The words echoed hollowly, swallowed by the avalanche of condemnation rising around him. And then, Jasmine Crockett rose. She stepped forward, each stride deliberate, her gaze locked on the man who had once seemed untouchable. She stopped at the center of the chamber, turned toward the microphone, and spoke with a voice that rang sharper than steel. "History will not remember your strength. It will not remember your bluster. It will not remember your lies. It will remember only this, that you sold out a nation for power." Her eyes burned as she leveled them on him, unflinching. "History will remember you, Donald J. Trump, not as a leader, but as the man who betrayed an entire people." The words sliced the air cleanly, leaving a silence so sharp it seemed to wound the chamber itself. Trump's jaw clenched, his fists trembling, but no reply came. The cameras caught it all, the rage in his eyes, the quiver in his lips, the silence of a man who had no defense left to give. The chairman gave a final nod. Security stepped forward, their black uniforms cutting through the chaos like blades. Two men flanked Trump, their hands hovering close but not yet touching. He pulled back at first, his face twisting with indignation. "Don't touch me! I am your president! I am your president!" The words spilled out in a frenzy, desperate, manic. But the crowd's roar drowned him. The chants rose higher, shaking the very rafters. "Traitor! Traitor! Traitor!" One by one, the cameras swung, capturing the moment from every angle. The once most powerful man in the world, his face contorted with fury, being escorted away beneath the avalanche of his downfall. He fought to stand tall, to reclaim even a shred of dignity. But the weight of the verdict, the echo of the chants, the cold grip of history pressing down, crushed him. His shoulders sagged, his steps faltered. And for the first time, Donald J. Trump looked not like a president, not like a titan, but like a man defeated. The cameras lingered, feeding the world its final image. Trump disappearing down the aisle, swallowed by guards, his figure dwarfed by the towering walls of justice he could no longer bend to his will. Crockett remained still, her gaze following him until the doors closed behind. She did not cheer. She did not gloat. Her silence was the verdict's exclamation point. Reporters' voices filled the chamber, carried on the airwaves to millions watching live. President Trump escorted from the chamber after being charged with betrayal. Chants of traitor ring out as impeachment proceedings loom. A historic day, the downfall of a president etched into history. The crowd outside surged as news broke. Some shouted in triumph, some in grief, others in disbelief. But no one could deny what they had witnessed. The chamber emptied slowly, senators murmuring, reporters racing, security moving with urgency. Yet one sound remained, echoing against the marble long after the doors closed. The chant, relentless, thunderous, undeniable. "Traitor! Traitor! Traitor!" And so it ended. Not with dignity, not with silence, but with a verdict shouted by the people, carried on the wind, etched into the annals of history. Donald Trump had fallen. The betrayal had been unmasked. And the story closed, not as politics, but as judgment. A political sentence that could never be undone. In the end, the fall of a leader was not just about one man's betrayal, but about the timeless truth that power without integrity is nothing but ruin. Nations are not built on the ambitions of the few, but on the trust of the many. And when that trust is broken, even the mightiest throne can crumble. May this story remind us that true strength is not in silencing others, but in standing for justice, even when it costs us everything. If this story unsettled you, don't look away. Carry it, share it, talk about it, like, comment, and send it to someone who still believes justice is worth fighting for. Subscribe to Harrison Stories, where betrayal is exposed and truth is given a voice. Hit the bell, because the next chapter isn't quiet. It's fierce, and it may forever change how you see power. This tale is a fictional dramatization, born from real wounds, real courage, and the timeless struggle between corruption and conscience. Any resemblance to actual people or events is symbolic, meant for reflection, warning, and the call to stand for what's right. Thank you for watching. Justice is not given, it is fought for. This is Harrison Stories.